My secretary is twice the woman you'll ever be." The words cut through the rooftop noise so cleanly that for one strange second, the city itself seemed to go quiet. Dorian Vale stood near the bar with a crystal glass in one hand, his jaw tight, his eyes hard, as though pride had taken control of his mouth before wisdom could stop it. The silver lights of downtown Chicago stretched behind him. Investors, executives, and polished strangers filled the rooftop with laughter, music, and money. A moment earlier, it had all looked effortless. Now every face near him held the same stunned pause. Across from him stood Nia. She did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not beg him to take it back. She only stared at him. Her blue dress moved lightly in the evening wind. One hand rested at her side. The other still held the stem of her untouched glass. She looked less like a wife caught in humiliation, and more like a woman deciding whether the man before her was still someone she recognized. Dorian had said many careless things in recent months. This was not one of them. This one had teeth. The reaction did not come all at once. It moved across the rooftop in waves. First, the two executives nearest the bar stopped speaking mid-sentence. One lowered his drink, without looking away. A woman near the piano turned her head slowly, as if she thought she had heard wrong. Across the terrace, laughter thinned, then disappeared in pockets. Even the low music from the speakers seemed too soft to survive the shift in the air. Celeste Ardan stood only a few feet from Dorian. A moment earlier, she had been wearing the composed expression she carried so well in public, smooth, polished, almost untouchable. Now that look cracked. Not fully, not enough for anyone careless to call it panic, but enough for Nia to see it. Enough to catch the quick change in her eyes, the stillness in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around the leather folder she had been carrying all evening. This was no longer office closeness, dressed up as efficiency. No one standing there could pretend they had misread the tension. A few guests looked at Nia with awkward sympathy. Others looked at Dorian with the curious discomfort people wear when they know they are watching a private wound open in public. Nobody stepped in. Nobody spoke. Wealthy rooms rarely rush to save dignity once it starts bleeding. Nia remained still at the center of it all. And somehow that made everyone else more uneasy. She gave them no easy scene, no raised voice, no shattered glass, only silence. And the kind of silence that forces every person nearby to sit inside what was just said. Before Nia spoke, "Let me ask you something. What do you do when the person you once believed in more than anyone decides, in one cruel sentence, to make you small in front of a room full of strangers? Do you fight for the truth of who you are, right there where the insult lands? Do you protect your pride and walk away before the damage spreads? Or do you stay still long enough to let everyone see exactly who broke first?" Because that was the real question hanging over the rooftop that night. Not whether Dorian had gone too far. He had, not whether the room had heard him clearly. It had. The real question was what Nia Calloway would do next. And none of them, not the board members, not the polished investors, not the woman standing too close to her husband, had the slightest idea that this was not the kind of insult a man walks away from unchanged. Some words bruise a moment. Others expose a life. This one was about to do both. Nia's lips parted slightly, but her voice, when it came, was calm enough to shame the noise around her. "Do you believe that?" No one moved. The question was not loud. It did not need to be. It crossed the distance between them, with more force than shouting ever could. It gave Dorian one last opening, one last narrow bridge back from the edge he had stepped onto in anger. He looked at her, not past her, not through her, at her. For a brief second, something flickered across his face. Regret, perhaps, or the first cold touch of fear. But neither one was strong enough to overcome the thing that had ruled him all evening. Pride fed by attention, by public image, by months of becoming too comfortable in rooms where people admired him more than they corrected him. His mouth did not open. He offered no apology, no denial, no desperate attempt to pull the poison back out of the air. He only stood there, stiff and silent, with the city lights behind him and the whole rooftop waiting. That silence told Nia everything. It told her the insult had not slipped. It had lived somewhere inside him long enough to find shape. It told her the distance she had been feeling was not confusion anymore. It was truth, standing in front of witnesses with a drink in its hand. Nia lowered her glass to the bar beside her with such care that the soft touch of crystal against stone sounded louder than it should have. She gave a single nod, small and controlled, as if some final piece inside her had settled into place. Not broken, settled. The kind of quiet decision a person makes when pain stops being confusing and becomes clear. Then she turned. Her heels moved across the rooftop with measured grace. No rush, no trembling, no backward glance. She did not offer the room the performance it expected from a wounded woman. She left Dorian standing in the center of his own sentence, while the people around him shifted awkwardly and made space for her without being asked. A few eyes followed her with pity, a few with respect. One older investor lowered his gaze altogether, as though he understood there were some moments a decent person should not stare at too long. Dorian took half a step forward, then stopped. Maybe he wanted to call her name. Maybe he wanted to explain. Maybe he had only now started to hear himself the way everyone else had. Whatever moved through him, it came too late. The damage had already chosen its shape. Near him, Celeste remained silent. For the first time all evening, she looked less like a woman close to power, and more like someone who had wandered too near a line she did not understand. By the time Nia reached the edge of the rooftop stairs, nobody was paying attention to the skyline anymore. The deal celebration was still dressed in elegance. Glass railings still caught the city glow. Expensive coats still brushed past polished shoulders. But the mood had shifted so completely that the whole evening now felt split into two parts. Before Dorian spoke, and after, he remained near the bar, motionless, as if stepping after her would force him to face something he was not ready to name. The room had started breathing again, but not normally. Conversations returned in fragments. A whisper here, a glance there, the kind of strained movement people fall into when they know they have witnessed more than a marriage crack. They have watched a man misjudge the one person he should have understood best. Dorian still did not know it. He did not know that the woman walking away from him in silence had helped build more of his world than half the people applauding him that night. He did not know that her calm was not weakness. It was control. It was memory. It was a line being drawn by someone who had given too much to be spoken to, like she was disposable. And he did not know that this moment, this single public wound, would soon force everyone in his world to see Nia Calloway as she truly was, not as the wife standing off to the side, not as the woman he assumed would endure anything, but as the last person he should have tried to make feel small. If someone you loved said this to you in front of a crowd, would you walk away, or would you make them regret it? Tell me in the comments. And if you love stories where silence speaks louder than revenge, subscribe before this gets worse. Chicago wore a tired gray that afternoon, and the lecture hall matched it. Rows of stiff chairs faced a stage where a speaker moved through slide after slide with the energy of a man who loved hearing himself more than being useful. Most of the audience looked trapped. A few took notes out of duty. Others stared ahead with polite regret. Nia Calloway sat near the middle with a notebook on her lap and boredom hidden behind a calm face. She had already decided the lecture was a waste of time when the side door opened and a man slipped in late, scanning the room for a seat. He found the empty chair beside her. His tie sat a little crooked. His hair looked as if he had fixed it in a hurry. He dropped into the seat, exhaled once, then leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Tell me if this gets interesting." Nia kept her eyes on the stage. It already failed. He turned and looked at her properly then, surprised, amused, and instantly more awake than he had been when he walked in. "I'm Dorian," he whispered after a moment. "Nia." Another, long, useless point droned from the stage. Dorian glanced up, then back at her. "Do you come to these often?" "No. So, this is not some strange hobby." That earned him a quick sideways look. "Do I seem like someone who spends free time collecting boring lectures?" He smiled. "No. You seem like someone who judges people quietly." "I do a lot of things quietly." That answer held him. By the time the session ended, Nia had forgotten half the lecture, but not the stranger beside her. In a room full of rehearsed voices, his felt human, and that mattered more than either of them knew yet. They left the building together, because neither of them seemed in a hurry to return to the rest of the evening. Outside, the cold pressed lightly against their skin, and Chicago moved around them with its usual impatience. Cars rolled past in streams of light. People crossed corners with coffee cups and tired faces. A food spot near the block ahead sent warm grease and salt into the air, and Dorian glanced toward it. "Are you hungry?" he asked, "or do you judge cheap food too?" Nia looked at him. "I only judge bad company. Then, I still have a chance." That line should have sounded practiced. It did not. He said it with enough ease to make her smile before she meant to. They ended up in a narrow diner with cracked booths, bright overhead lights, and fries that tasted better than the place deserved. Dorian talked with both hands sometimes, especially when a thought grabbed him. He spoke about work, money, and the kind of future he wanted with the open urgency of someone who had spent years refusing to think small. "I want to build something real," he said. "Not something that makes noise for a year and disappears. I want scale. I want weight. I want to walk into rooms one day and know I belong there because I built my way in." Nia listened without rushing to impress him back. She liked that he spoke honestly, without pretending he wanted less than he did. Then he asked, "What about you?" She reached for a fry and answered without drama. "Peace, purpose, and enough money to never stay where I'm disrespected." Dorian went still for a second. It was not the kind of answer men forgot. Not because it was loud, but because it was clean. It told him more about her than a long speech would have. She was not chasing attention. She was protecting dignity. Their plates emptied slowly. Their conversation did not. What should have been a single evening stretched into many. After that first meal, Nia and Dorian kept finding reasons to see each other again. Sometimes it was coffee before work. Sometimes it was a late walk after long days. Neither of them wanted to end alone. Neither one said much about where it was going in the beginning. They did not need to. The rhythm formed on its own. Their early relationship had no polished shine. It had train rides, missed buses, cheap takeout, and tired laughter in borrowed time. Dorian worked with the hunger of a man who felt late to his own future. Nia carried herself with steadiness. Even when money was tight and the week had been too long, she did not complain for effect. She adjusted, planned, and kept moving. When his rent came due before a payment cleared, they made one dinner stretch into two. When her work hours ran late, he waited outside with coffee and that same crooked smile that had first caught her off guard. They learned each other through ordinary pressure, not grand moments. That made the bond stronger. Some nights they sat on the floor of his apartment, with papers spread around them, half talking, half thinking. Other nights, they said almost nothing at all. Nia would lean back against the couch, shoes off, and listen, while Dorian worked through ideas out loud. He trusted her with the unfinished version of himself, the one full of drive, doubt, and more ambition than proof. That mattered. A lot of people know how to love ease. Fewer know how to love effort while it is still building. By the time winter settled deep into the city, their closeness no longer felt new. It felt necessary, not in a desperate way, in a grounding way, like each had become part of how the other made sense of the week. Neither of them had much yet, but they were already becoming important to each other. Dorian had vision in abundance. It lived in the way he spoke, the way he planned, and the way he refused to believe his life would stay small. Even when he had little to show for it, he carried himself like a man already arguing with the future. He wanted more, expected more, and pushed toward more with a force that could be exhausting if you did not understand the heart inside it. Nia understood it. She also understood what he lacked. Where Dorian rushed, she measured. Where he chased 10 ideas at once, she asked which one deserved the energy. He saw possibility everywhere. She saw structure, timing, and risk. He moved fast on instinct. She moved carefully on judgment. Their differences did not pull them apart. They made them useful to each other. He brought fire. She brought shape. There were evenings when Dorian would pace the apartment, speaking through another idea for a firm, a deal, a future no one else could see yet. He talked about markets, influence, and building something that would outlast fashion and luck. Nia listened from the table, a notebook open, asking the kind of questions that trimmed fantasy down to form. How much would it cost? Who would trust you first? What happens if your best case never comes? He never liked those questions at first. He always needed them, and she knew it. What Dorian admired most was that Nia never challenged him to make herself feel bigger. She challenged him to make him sharper. She did not flatter. She refined. She did not shrink before ambition. She tested whether it could stand. That gave him something rare, not applause, alignment. By then, Dorian had already begun to realize that Nia was not simply kind or intelligent or easy to be with. She was stabilizing, the kind of person whose presence made big dreams feel less reckless and more possible. At that stage of his life, most people heard Dorian's ambition and smiled politely. They liked him well enough. They admitted he was smart. Some even called him promising. But promise is what people say when they do not want to risk belief. It sounds generous while keeping distance. Nia was different. She watched him closely, not as a dreamer performing confidence, but as a man still trying to build proof around what he already felt inside. She saw the frustration he hid under charm, the impatience that flared when doors stayed closed, the quiet shame that followed moments when the world reminded him he had vision without backing. She saw how badly he wanted to matter, and she did not laugh at him for wanting a larger life. That alone set her apart. When he spoke, she listened, as if his unfinished plans deserved serious attention. When he doubted himself, she did not rush to comfort him with empty praise. She asked sharper questions. She made him explain more clearly. She held his words to a higher standard, which told him something praise never could, that she believed he might one day become exactly what he kept describing. He began to feel it in small moments, in the way she remembered details from conversations weeks old, in the way she challenged weak thinking without making him feel small, in the way she looked at him during quiet pauses, as if she could already see shape where others only saw effort. The world had not given him proof yet. No office, no title worth envying, no financial safety, no crowd waiting to clap when he entered a room. But Nia did not need applause to recognize value. She believed in him before his life offered evidence, not blindly, not foolishly. She believed because she had measured his hunger, studied his mind, and decided there was something real there, worth standing beside. Dorian felt that belief, and once he did, he never forgot it. By the time spring began softening the city, what stood between Nia and Dorian was no longer casual. It was not built on grand speeches or polished romance. It was built on repetition, presence, and the growing comfort of being fully known. He had become the person she expected to hear from at the end of the day. She had become the person whose opinion mattered before he made a move that carried weight. Without saying it plainly, they had started building a shared center. Their connection was changing shape. They were no longer two people enjoying each other in passing. They were becoming two people who made each other stronger. Dorian began bringing her more than conversation. He brought her unfinished plans, doubts he hid from others, and questions he did not trust many people to answer honestly. Nia gave him more than affection. She gave him clarity, steadiness, and the kind of faith that still expected effort. She did not stand beside him as decoration. She stood beside him as substance. That difference would matter later. There were nights when they sat together in silence, tired but at ease, with the city humming beyond the window and no pressure to fill the room with noise. Those moments did as much as the long talks did. They created trust. They taught both of them that love did not always arrive in dramatic form. Sometimes it arrived as peace, sometimes as understanding, sometimes as the simple relief of not having to pretend. By then, even their future had started sounding different. Not mine, not yours, ours. Neither of them said it in those exact words yet, but it lived in the choices already forming between them, in the way they leaned toward each other, in the way they thought ahead, in the way Dorian's ambition no longer sounded like a lonely climb, because Nia was in the picture now, and with her beside him, he no longer felt like a man chasing a life alone. Dorian's ambition had never been the problem. The problem was that ambition alone did not pay for office space, legal filing, payroll, or trust. By the time he decided he was ready to launch his own advisory firm, he had already spent months carrying the idea around like a second heartbeat. He talked about market gaps, client relationships, and the kind of boutique operation he believed could grow into something serious. On paper, it sounded bold. In person, it sounded even stronger. But the people he needed to convince did not care about bold. They cared about proof, money, and names that could protect their risk. Most days ended with some version of the same answer. Too early, too unknown, too thinly backed. Some meetings were polite enough to disguise the rejection. Others were not. One potential partner praised Dorian's intelligence and then told him he needed 10 more years and twice the credibility. Another liked his pitch, asked sharp questions, promised to follow up, and vanished. A third said he had presence, but presence was not capital. That night, he came home carrying all of it. The apartment was warm, but he entered like a man still standing in cold weather. His coat came off with more force than necessary. His tie landed across the arm of the couch. Nia, seated at the small table with papers and tea beside her, looked up the moment he walked in. She did not ask if it went well. She already knew. Dorian crossed to the window and stood there with both hands on his hips, staring out at the city like it had insulted him personally. "They keep saying the same thing," he said at last. "They act like I need permission to become what I already know I can become." Nia let the silence hold for a moment. Then she asked, "What exactly are they afraid of?" He turned toward her, tired and angry. "That I don't have backing. That I don't have history. That I don't have someone in the room willing to stake anything real on me." The bitterness in his voice did not come from ego alone. It came from exhaustion. He had knocked on enough doors to know talent was not always the deciding factor. Sometimes people wanted comfort more than vision. Sometimes they wanted a familiar name more than a strong mind. Nia studied him quietly. What she saw was not a man failing. It was a man standing in the painful space between potential and proof, and he was not used to being told to wait. Nia did not answer him right away. Instead, she rose from the table, walked to the side cabinet, and pulled out a plain folder she had placed there days earlier. She carried it back with calm hands and set it in front of him as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Dorian frowned. "What's this?" "A beginning," she said. He opened the folder. Inside were pages arranged with a level of order that told him at once this was no casual gesture. The first section mapped out a phased capital plan, lean enough to launch, careful enough to survive early pressure. The next outlined basic legal steps, licensing priorities, and an operating sequence that would let him move without drowning in startup mistakes. Behind that sat names, numbers, and short notes in Nia's neat handwriting: attorneys, 2 possible advisory contacts, a former client from her consulting circle who trusted her judgment, and 1 small investor who had once mentioned interest in emerging firms if the structure made sense. Dorian looked up. "Nia." She sat back down. "You said they keep asking who is willing to stake something real on you." I thought that question deserved a better answer. He looked through the papers again, slower this time. Each section solved a problem he had been trying to attack from the wrong end. She had not built him a fantasy. She had built him a path. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "A while. A while. You were not the only one taking your future seriously." He stared at the folder, then at her again, and something inside him shifted. Not because she had surprised him, because she had understood him deeply enough to build what he needed before he was humble enough to admit how badly he needed it. "You did all this without telling me." Nia gave a small shrug. "You were busy proving you could do everything yourself." That landed with no cruelty, only truth. He lowered himself into the chair across from her. "This isn't advice. This is structure. Yes. This is real. Yes." For the first time in weeks, the defeat on his face loosened. In its place came something quieter, heavier, and far more dangerous to the heart: relief. Dorian reached the last page and stopped. There, beneath the projected cost range and the early funding schedule, sat a number written in clean black ink. His eyes moved over it once, then back again, as if the amount might change if he looked harder. It did not. He lifted his head slowly. "Is this from you?" "Yes." The room seemed to narrow. Their apartment was still the same apartment. The radiator still clicked. The city still hummed outside the window. Yet the air between them had changed because this was no longer about encouragement, or planning, or emotional support dressed as loyalty. This was risk. Personal risk. Real money. From a woman who had worked too hard to waste it. "Nia, this is too much." "No," she said. "It's enough to move." He pushed the folder back slightly, almost on instinct. "You don't need to do this." She met his eyes. "I know." That answer undid him more than any argument could have. She was not offering because she had to, not because she was trying to rescue him from failure or prove devotion through sacrifice. She was offering because she had measured the risk and chosen it anyway. There was nothing careless about Nia. If she put something on the line, she had already thought it through harder than most people ever would. Dorian leaned back and rubbed a hand over his face. "Why would you put this much of yourself into something that hasn't even started yet?" Nia's expression softened, though her voice stayed steady. "Because I know who you are before the world does." The words settled over him with a weight that went deeper than gratitude. She was not betting on a title. There was no company yet. No polished office. No headlines. No applause waiting on the other side. She was placing her faith in the version of him that existed only in struggle, effort, and unfinished promise. He looked down at the folder again, then at her hands resting calmly on the table. She believed in him before success could defend her choice. That kind of belief was rare enough to change a life. Dorian understood that. He also understood something else in the same breath. If he ever became the man he kept saying he would become, some part of that future would always belong to this moment, this room, and the woman sitting across from him with enough vision to see his worth before the world agreed. Dorian rose so quickly his chair scraped the floor. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and stopped in front of Nia, looking down at her with a kind of disbelief that had nothing to do with the money alone. His eyes had changed. The anger was gone. So was the frustration. What remained was raw emotion stripped of performance. A man seeing love in one of its clearest forms and not knowing how to carry the weight of it gracefully. He bent slightly and took her face in his hands. "Nia," he said again, softer this time, as if her name alone was struggling to hold everything he meant. She smiled, small and warm, though there was seriousness in her too. She knew what this moment was. Not a rescue. Not some dramatic turning point meant to flatter either of them. It was trust. Handed over without noise. Dorian looked at her, as if he were trying to memorize her from the inside out. "You believe in me that much?" "I believe in what you could become," she said. "There's a difference. So, do not waste it." That nearly made him laugh. But emotion caught in his throat first. He lowered his forehead to hers for a second. Both of them standing in the middle of a small apartment that suddenly felt larger than most ballrooms ever would. There are moments in love when tenderness carries more force than desire. This was one of them. When he kissed her, it was slow and grateful. The kind of kiss that feels less like taking and more like answering. It held respect, wonder, a silent promise to become worthy of what had just been placed in his hands. Later, they sat side by side on the couch, with the folder open across their knees, talking through the pages together. The shift between them was subtle, but permanent. They were no longer only dreaming beside each other. They were making choices that bound their futures in practical ways. Years later, many people would speak of Dorian's rise as if it began with confidence. It did not. It began with a woman who saw farther, planned better, and loved him enough to put action behind belief. That night became one of the deepest anchors in their relationship, not because it made life easier at once, because it proved what lived under their affection was strong enough to hold weight. They married during the season when hope still felt simple. There was no ballroom, no towering floral display, no guest list built for status. The ceremony happened on a rooftop at sunset, with a small circle of people who mattered, and a skyline that looked less like wealth than possibility. The air held a soft evening warmth, and the city seemed to pause long enough to watch 2 people promise each other a life they had not yet built. Nia wore elegance the way she always did, without needing attention to confirm it. Dorian looked at her as if he had reached the center of his own ambition, and found that it was not a company or a title waiting there, but a person. When he took her hand, there was nothing careless in the gesture. He knew what she had already given him. He knew the future ahead would ask much more. Their vows were simple, direct, and sincere. No overworked poetry, no performance. Just truth spoken by two people who had already seen enough of life to value honesty over display. After they married, they moved forward with the firm. Ashbourne did not begin with glass walls or polished branding. It began with practical furniture, borrowed confidence, and long workdays in a modest office that felt one bad month away from falling apart. Their first team was small enough to fit every problem into one room. Dorian handled pitch meetings, client pursuit, and the constant pressure of making the firm look stronger than its age. Nia helped shape everything around the edges, reviewing documents, tightening proposals, catching weak assumptions, and asking the hard questions before the market got the chance. They built in layers. A better client here, a cleaner presentation there, a sharper structure, a wiser decision, a stronger hire. At night, they went home tired, but it was the good kind of tired, earned, shared, and tied to something that belonged to both of them. Their life was still lean. Their future was still uncertain. Yet there was meaning in the strain because they were not standing on separate paths. They were carrying the same weight together. That made the struggle feel less like hardship and more like construction. Ashbourne's first real steps upward did not arrive with spectacle. They arrived quietly, almost carefully, like something testing its own legs before running. The first breakthrough came through a client Dorian had chased for weeks. He had revised the pitch twice, trimmed the language, sharpened the numbers, and stayed up half the night before the meeting going over objections with Nia across the table. She had cut what was weak, strengthened what was vague, and reminded him that confidence without discipline could lose a room faster than fear ever would. He won the account. Not a giant one, not the kind that changed their lives in a day, but it was enough to matter, enough to signal movement, enough to make the office feel less like a gamble and more like the beginning of something durable. From there, other gains followed. A referral, a second contract, a conversation that turned into real interest because someone had heard Ashbourne was small but sharp. The firm began forming a reputation before it formed comfort. Dorian's hunger pushed it forward. Nia's structure kept it from wasting motion. Together, they created a rhythm that made people trust what they were building, even before the company had history behind it. They both knew the truth. His ambition opened doors. Her foundation kept them from closing. In those early months, success still looked modest from the outside. Their office was not impressive. Their margins were thin. Their future was far from guaranteed. Yet inside that fragile stage lived something stronger than appearance. They had direction, they had discipline, they had each other's full belief, and that gave the firm more stability than most people realized. Dorian began walking differently, not with arrogance, but with the confidence of a man finally seeing proof meet effort. Nia watched it happen with quiet satisfaction. She did not need credit in the room. She could already see the larger shape taking form. Ashbourne was no longer an idea. It was becoming real, and beneath every upward step was the same truth that would one day matter more than Dorian understood. He was rising because he had vision, yes, but also because the woman beside him had given that vision ground strong enough to stand on. Ashbourne did not rise slowly. What began as a lean firm held together by long hours and careful decisions started gaining real traction. One strong client led to another. Quiet recommendations turned into serious introductions. The office grew busier, the meetings grew larger, and the numbers on internal reports began carrying the kind of weight that changes how people speak when they enter a room. Dorian had wanted momentum. Now momentum had arrived, and it wanted more from everyone. From the outside, it looked like his success. From the inside, Nia knew better. She was still there, though rarely in ways outsiders could measure. She reviewed draft proposals before Dorian sent them. She caught weak assumptions buried inside aggressive forecasts. She noticed where emotion had started shaping decisions that should have stayed grounded in fact. When hiring became more frequent, she flagged personalities that looked polished but lacked depth. When expansion ideas came too quickly, she asked the questions no one else wanted to ask, not because they were rude, but because they were necessary. Dorian relied on her more than he admitted. Late at night, he would call her into the study with a file in hand and ask what she thought of a deal structure, a staffing move, or a risky client. He trusted her eye. He trusted her instincts. He trusted her enough to adjust course when she pointed out something he had missed. That pattern became part of Ashbourne's hidden strength. Nia never needed her name on the website to matter. She did not need a title to influence outcomes. She understood something many people in business never learn. Value is not always loud. Sometimes it sits at the edge of the room, watching carefully, speaking only when needed, and still saving the day more often than the person holding the microphone. Ashbourne grew because Dorian could sell a future. It stayed solid because Nia knew how to protect one. At that stage, they still looked like partners from the inside, still sounded like a team in private, still moved around the same vision, with enough harmony to make success feel shared. But success has a way of bringing new voices into a man's orbit. And those voices were getting louder. Money changed the rooms Dorian entered first. Then it changed the way those rooms looked at him. Invitations began arriving with greater frequency: private dinners, conference panels, investor retreats, charity events where power dressed itself in elegance and called it generosity. Magazine features followed, then interviews. Then the kind of introductions where people lowered their voices slightly before saying his name, as if importance could be measured by tone alone. Dorian had always wanted access. Now access wanted him. At first, Nia was proud. She remembered the young man who had once walked into a dull lecture late with a crooked tie and more drive than proof. Watching him grow into the version of himself he had promised was satisfying in ways she did not always say aloud. He had worked for this. He had earned part of it. But admiration is not neutral. The wrong kind of praise does not simply celebrate a person. It trains them. Dorian started receiving too much of it. People laughed harder at his jokes. They repeated his ideas back to him, as though they were sharper than they had been 5 minutes earlier. Young analysts studied his posture. Clients wanted meetings that ran long because they liked being near his confidence. Somewhere inside all that approval, his center began shifting. Not dramatically at first. It showed up in small ways. He started dressing with more care for public events than private evenings. He checked messages through dinner, then apologized without really leaving the screen. He began enjoying being admired by people who knew his title better than his character. Attention settled on him like a second skin, and he wore it too easily. Nia noticed because she knew the original version of him. She knew the hunger that built him. She knew the insecurity hidden under ambition. She knew how much stronger he had once become when someone challenged him, instead of praising him too quickly. But the more influence he gained, the more correction started feeling like interruption. He still loved her. That was not yet the problem. The problem was simpler and more dangerous. He had started enjoying the world's applause in ways that made private tenderness feel less urgent than public relevance. And marriage rarely survives long when one person begins feeding on attention the other cannot compete with and should never have to. The first real losses did not look dramatic. They looked ordinary enough to excuse. A missed dinner because a client ran late, a weekend call that turned into half a Saturday, an anniversary dinner moved to another evening, then shifted again because something urgent came up. Dorian always had a reason, and the reasons were often real. That made them harder to argue with. Nia understood pressure. She understood timing. She had helped build the company that now demanded so much from him. But understanding a thing does not stop it from hurting. Soon, the pattern settled in. Nia would set a table for two and watch one plate go cold. She would ask how his day went and receive a tired answer with no doorway into anything deeper. She would mention something that mattered to her and see his attention split in two, one half with her, the other still trapped inside a call, a deal, a problem, a room he had already left but never fully exited. Even when he was home, he did not always arrive. That was the part she felt most. He kissed her hello. He thanked her for waiting. He sometimes reached for her hand without looking up from whatever held his mind. These gestures should have counted for something, but they began feeling like habits, not presence. The warmth that once filled their small apartment during the early years had thinned into efficiency. Nia missed being spoken to with focus, missed hearing him ask a real question and wait for the full answer, missed the late-night conversations that used to drift between work and life and fear and hope, until neither of them remembered who had started talking first. Now most exchanges felt shorter, practical, managed. Dorian still saw himself as a man working hard for both of them. Nia started feeling like a woman receiving whatever remained after the company had taken the first and strongest part of him. No scandal had happened. No betrayal had been named. Yet emotional absence has its own way of hollowing a space. It does not burst through the door. It removes little things quietly, until one day the room no longer feels lived in. And their marriage was beginning to feel that way. Nia did not stay silent because she was weak. She stayed silent at first because she believed in timing, and because she knew not every shift deserved immediate alarm. Some seasons are hard without being fatal. Some distances can still be crossed if both people are willing to walk. She gave Dorian room to correct himself. She gave work pressure the benefit of context. She even told herself more than once that once this phase settled, he would return to himself. But he did not, so she began addressing it gently, not with accusation, not with theatrics, with truth. One evening, after he came home late and distracted, she asked, "Do you realize you've answered 3 of my questions tonight without hearing any of them?" Dorian looked up from the email on his phone. "That's not fair. It isn't meant to be fair. It's meant to be honest." He set the phone down, but only halfway, as if part of him still belonged to the message. "Nia, I've had a long day. I know. That's not new." He studied her, already defensive. "So what exactly are you saying?" She held his gaze. "I'm saying you are here less, even when you're standing in front of me." That should have opened a door. Instead, it irritated him. He sighed and loosened his collar. "Everything becomes a problem with you once I'm tired." Nia went still. "My concern is not a mood." He rubbed his forehead. "You analyze everything. Every delay, every rough week, every missed moment, like it needs a deeper meaning. Because it often did. Because that was precisely how she had helped him avoid mistakes for years. Because wisdom tends to notice shifts before damage becomes visible." But Dorian no longer received her perception as support. The more pressure he lived under, the more her insight seemed to feel, in his mind, like one more demand, one more correction, one more voice telling him he was failing somewhere. He had once relied on her clarity. Now he was starting to resent how clearly she could see him. And nothing chills a marriage faster than the moment one person begins treating the other's wisdom as inconvenience instead of care. The dinner reservation had been made 2 weeks earlier. A quiet restaurant. Corner table. One evening blocked off in both their calendars, after Dorian promised, more than once, that he would be there. Nia chose a dress he liked, left work early, and arrived on time. The candle between the place settings burned steadily while she waited. She checked her phone once, then again. The first message came 15 minutes late. "Running behind. Big client. Start without me." She did not start. She waited. The second message came nearly 40 minutes later. "Need a little more time." By the time the waiter approached for the third time, his tone had shifted from attentive to gently sympathetic. "Would you like me to hold your order a bit longer?" Nia looked at the empty seat across from her and said, "No, you can clear the second menu." She sat there through the rest of the meal alone, listening to other people's laughter fold around her, while her own table felt smaller by the minute. The food cooled faster than she ate it. When the waiter finally asked whether she wanted dessert packed to go, she almost laughed at how neatly humiliation could arrive without anyone raising their voice. Dorian got home close to midnight. He entered with apology already prepared, coat over one arm, energy from the day still clinging to him. "I'm sorry," he said. "The meeting stretched. I couldn't walk away." Nia sat on the couch, shoes off, silence wrapped tightly around her. "You keep saying that." He frowned. "Because it's true." She stood. "That doesn't make it less damaging." He exhaled, tired and annoyed. "Nia, please. Not tonight." Her eyes sharpened. "That is exactly the problem. Not tonight. Not this weekend. Not after this meeting. Not until things settle. Your life with me keeps getting moved to the edge of your schedule. That's unfair." "No," she said quietly. "Unfair is building a life with someone and then acting like they should feel honored by your leftovers." The room went still. For the first time, the truth between them no longer sounded like strain. It sounded like separation beginning to speak clearly. After that argument, Silence sat between them longer than either expected. Dorian eventually muttered something about pressure, deadlines, expectations, things Nia already knew and had never denied. Then he disappeared into the bedroom, leaving the conversation unfinished in the way people do when they want discomfort to shrink on its own. But some truths do not shrink once spoken. They settle into the walls and wait. Nia remained in the living room for a long time. The apartment was comfortable now, far more comfortable than the early years when they counted every dollar and stretched every plan. The furniture was better, the lighting softer, the shelves fuller. Success had touched their home, but comfort had not protected it. She looked around the room and felt the strange ache of having everything appear stable while something important weakened right in front of her. She loved him. That was the hardest part. If he had become cruel, the answer might have been cleaner. If betrayal had already taken obvious form, anger might have made decisions easier. But this was more painful because what was breaking them still wore the face of the man she married. He still kissed her goodnight sometimes, still thanked her for helping him, still reached for her in sleep on nights when stress loosened his guard enough for his body to remember what his habits kept forgetting. So she stayed, not because she believed nothing was wrong, not because patience had blinded her. She stayed because memory still lived in her. She remembered the man with the crooked tie and restless ambition, the one who valued her questions, the one who once looked at her as if her belief in him was the safest place he had ever stood. She had seen too much truth in him to walk away from the first long season of loss without certainty. But hope had changed shape. It was no longer soft. It was watchful. Nia was no longer waiting for work to calm down. She was waiting to see whether there was still a man inside Dorian Vale who knew how to return to the woman who helped build his life before the world started applauding it. As Dorian's name gained more weight in public, Nia's own financial life grew in a different direction, quieter, steadier, and far less visible. She never cared for the kind of success that needed to announce itself before it entered a room. While Ashbourne climbed and Dorian's face started appearing in business magazines, she kept working with the same discipline that had shaped her from the beginning. Her consulting work expanded through trust, not spectacle. Clients passed her name privately. Founders sought her judgment because she saw weakness early and spoke with precision. She did not flatter. She clarified. In rooms full of noise, that made her valuable. Money came gradually at first, through retained advisory roles, strategic introductions, and equity positions in small firms that looked ordinary to people chasing faster wins. Nia had a gift for reading what others dismissed too quickly. She knew when a leadership team had real substance beneath rough presentation. She knew when a company had strong bones, but poor storytelling. She knew how to wait where others rushed. That patience paid. A few early investments grew well. One grew far beyond expectations. Another was acquired at a number that made even her wealth advisor pause before speaking. Nia reinvested carefully, always protecting privacy, always keeping her structures clean, always refusing the temptation to turn prosperity into performance. Dorian noticed that she was doing well, but not how well. Part of that was her own design. Part of it was his inattention. He had started living in a world where he assumed visibility and value moved together. Nia knew better. She had built enough to understand that some of the strongest positions in life are the ones no one studies closely until it is too late. By then, her wealth no longer depended on Ashbourne or on Dorian's success. She was becoming powerful in her own right. Not loudly, not publicly, not in any way that begged to be admired, but in ways that would one day matter far more than anyone inside Ashbourne understood. Nia's first investments in Ashbourne came from loyalty. She wanted to strengthen what they had built, and she knew early growth often depends on stable capital more than exciting language. At the start, her support made emotional sense as well as financial sense. She was protecting a shared dream. She was helping create room for the firm to breathe, stretch, and survive the fragile years when one bad quarter can damage confidence for far longer than numbers justify. But as Ashbourne expanded, her reasons evolved. She did not increase her position through one obvious move. That would have drawn attention and invited questions she did not want. Instead, she worked through layered structures designed for privacy and control. A trust here, a holding vehicle there. Advisors, who understood discretion, agreements built with clean logic, and careful distance from her personal name. She never acted recklessly. Every increase followed review, timing, and a purpose she could defend to herself without hesitation. At first, she bought more because she believed the firm still reflected enough of its founding values to be worth defending. Later, she bought more because she no longer trusted those values to protect themselves. That was the change. The company's outside image kept improving. Revenues rose. Press coverage sharpened. Dorian became more sought after, yet Nia saw something hidden inside the growth. The larger Ashbourne became, the easier it was for weak habits to hide inside polished outcomes. Leadership drift rarely announces itself during good quarters. It slips into culture while everyone is celebrating numbers. Nia wanted position before she needed power, so she kept building it. No one on the board traced the scale of her stake. No senior executive guessed how much of Ashbourne's stability now rested inside structures tied, quietly and legally, back to the woman most of them treated as the elegant wife who appeared at the right events and disappeared before strategy was discussed. That misunderstanding suited her, because support is one kind of love, protection is another, and by then, Nia had already started preparing for the day Ashbourne might need the second more than the first. The warning signs did not arrive as one dramatic failure. They appeared in patterns. Nia noticed them the way she always noticed things, by paying attention where others preferred comfort. Expenses tied to image began rising faster than expenses tied to substance. Office redesigns received quicker approval than operational upgrades. Travel budgets swelled for executives, whose results looked good, but not exceptional. Certain hires came in with polished resumes and expensive confidence, yet added more presence than discipline. None of those issues alone would have alarmed her. Together, they formed a message. Ashbourne was starting to care too much about looking powerful, and not enough about staying rigorous. In meetings, Dorian spoke more often about visibility, momentum, and market perception. Those things mattered, but Nia heard something missing beneath the language. Less caution, less patience, less willingness to hear unwelcome truth before it became expensive truth. She reviewed enough internal material to catch the drift. Approval processes had loosened around the wrong people. Some reporting lines were too dependent on personal loyalty. Certain costs passed through because no one wanted to be the person who slowed the pace of growth. Culture was changing too. Junior staff had begun treating proximity to Dorian like currency. People mirrored his preferences too quickly. Disagreement arrived with extra caution. That bothered Nia more than the spending did. A firm can recover from bad purchases. Recovery is harder when correction itself starts feeling unsafe. She raised concerns where she could. She asked quiet questions. She reviewed figures late into the night. She made notes in margins no one else seemed to read carefully enough. But what unsettled her most was not that Ashbourne had flaws. Every fast-growing company does. It was that the flaws now served ego. The firm had once been built through hunger, discipline, and precise choices made under pressure. Now some of its newer habits looked shaped by admiration, comfort, and the dangerous assumption that success would keep covering weaknesses long enough for no one to pay a price. Nia knew better. She had seen enough companies rise beautifully before becoming soft in the wrong places. Ashbourne was not there yet, but it was walking toward that edge. And Dorian, the man who once listened hardest when truth came without polish, was beginning to enjoy applause too much to hear warning clearly. There was a time when Nia could have walked into Dorian's study, named 3 risks, and watched him take every word seriously. That time was passing. He still heard her, technically. He still nodded, still asked a few questions, still thanked her for her thoughts when the conversation remained easy enough to keep his pride comfortable. But full listening had changed into partial listening, the kind that receives your words without truly letting them interrupt anything. Nia felt the difference every time she tried to raise something important. If she pointed out weak approvals, he said the team was under pressure. If she questioned spending tied to image, he called it strategic positioning. If she noted that certain people seemed to be growing too comfortable around unchallenged authority, he told her growth requires trust. He always had language ready, smooth, reasonable, polished language that made concern sound smaller than it was. That was when Nia understood she had reached a limit as a wife. Emotion complicated everything inside marriage. Memory softened consequences. Love created extra chances, extra patience, extra room for denial. As long as Dorian could place her concerns inside the category of personal tension, he could keep hearing them as domestic friction rather than business truth. So she began changing her mindset. If he would not respond properly to insight offered in private, he might one day be forced to respond to authority backed by structure. That realization did not come from revenge. It came from discipline. Nia had not built her own life by waiting for people to become ready for truths they kept avoiding. She reviewed her position in Ashbourne more seriously. She met with advisors who understood governance. She studied voting paths, influence points, exposure risks, and the conditions under which a major outside stakeholder could step in without chaos. She did not make a move yet. She prepared. Preparation was her language. The more Dorian drifted into assumption, the more Nia tightened her understanding of what leverage actually existed and how it could be used to protect the firm if needed. She was no longer thinking only like a wife, trying to save a marriage from neglect. She was thinking like an investor, deciding how long to tolerate leadership drift before intervention became an obligation. That shift happened quietly. No scene marked it. No declaration announced it. But from that point forward, Dorian was no longer the only person in Ashbourne with the power to change the future of the company. He just did not know it yet. Celeste Ardan entered Ashbourne the way certain people always enter powerful spaces, with enough polish to look harmless and enough instinct to become useful very quickly. She was hired as Dorian's executive secretary during a period when his schedule had become heavy enough to justify tighter control. On paper, the decision made sense. She had the right credentials, excellent references, and the kind of professional calm that reassured busy men who confuse smooth management with loyalty. She dressed with intention, never loud, always precise. She spoke clearly, moved efficiently, and had a talent for making urgency look elegant. Nia noticed her before she knew her name well. Not because Celeste was openly improper, she was smarter than that. What stood out was subtler. She placed herself near the center of Dorian's daily rhythm quickly. She anticipated his preferences too easily. She carried information in ways that gave her access beyond her title. She knew when to speak, when to stay quiet, and when to let admiration sit lightly enough on her face to feel flattering without seeming obvious. Dorian began mentioning her at home, mostly in practical ways at first. Celeste had reorganized his calendar. Celeste had saved a meeting from collapsing. Celeste had handled an investor change without confusion. Celeste understood the pace. Celeste stayed ahead of things. Celeste made difficult days easier. Nia listened. None of those remarks alone meant much. Competence deserves recognition, but frequency has meaning. Tone has meaning. Warmth inside. Repeated praise has meaning. Nia heard all three. What unsettled her was not simple jealousy. It was emotional pattern recognition. Dorian had started speaking about Celeste with a kind of relief that suggested she was absorbing more of his attention than her role required. That would have been concerning even in a healthy marriage. Inside one already thinning from neglect, it carried greater danger. Celeste did not need to cross an obvious line to become a problem. All she needed was proximity, timing, and a man growing too used to being understood first by the people who helped manage his public life. Nia had seen enough to know that boundary failures often begin there, long before anyone names them honestly. By then, the unease in Nia's life had divided into two separate paths, both leading somewhere she did not like. At home, her marriage no longer felt safely rooted. The distance between her and Dorian was not constant, but it was growing easier for him to live inside. He still returned to her bed. He still said the right things often enough to delay open collapse. Yet his habits were changing in ways that made tenderness feel less central and convenience more dangerous. Celeste's presence pressed against that weakness, like a test the marriage had not agreed to take. At Ashbourne, the company she had helped strengthen from the edges was beginning to carry too much vanity and too little correction. Dorian remained gifted, ambitious, and persuasive. None of that had vanished. But gifts become liabilities when no one can challenge them without friction. The more Nia studied both her marriage and the firm, the more she saw the same problem taking shape in two forms. Dorian had started mistaking admiration for alignment. That mistake can wound a home. It can also damage a company. One evening, after reviewing documents in the library while Dorian worked late again, Nia closed the folder in front of her and sat very still. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a clock marked the hour with mechanical patience. She thought about the woman she had been when Ashbourne began, hopeful, committed, certain that what they were building together had enough truth in it to survive success. She thought about the woman she had become since then, more powerful, more watchful, less willing to rely on hope alone. For the first time, both battles felt linked. If Dorian kept moving toward vanity, weak boundaries, and comfortable praise, the cost would not remain neatly separated between office and home. It would spread into leadership, into trust, into judgment, into whatever part of his life still depended on humility to remain healthy. Nia understood that clearly now. Her marriage was drifting. The company was drifting, and both were heading toward dangerous ground faster than Dorian seemed able or willing to see. Celeste Ardan did not enter Ashbourne like someone hoping to be noticed. She entered like someone who understood that the smartest way to gain ground in a powerful room was to look useful before looking important. She was polished from the first day, not flashy, not loud. Her clothes were always precise, cut clean, chosen with care. Her speech matched the same standard. She did not waste words, did not trip over herself, did not overplay confidence. She knew how to make people feel she had already solved the next problem before they finished naming the current one. In a firm where speed and appearance were both treated like strengths, that kind of presence traveled fast. What made her different was not beauty alone, though she knew she had that. It was control. Celeste understood timing. She knew when to enter a room, when to stand back, when to speak with certainty, and when to leave silence in place so others would fill it with trust. She handled schedules, pressure, last-minute changes, and executive moods with a kind of smooth competence that makes overworked men feel relieved in her presence. Relief, Nia knew, could become attachment if no one kept the boundaries clear, and Celeste knew that too. She moved around power with ease, but never carelessly. She remembered names. She observed who mattered. She picked up the hidden ranking inside a room before most people had finished introductions. She was efficient enough to be praised and subtle enough to keep that praise sounding deserved. On paper, she was exactly the kind of executive secretary a growing firm would want near its highest office. In practice, Nia sensed something more calculated, not openly improper, not reckless. Celeste was too smart for obvious mistakes, but there was an awareness in her, a deliberate softness around authority, a careful way of standing close without seeming to chase closeness, that made Nia pay attention. Some women seek power by trying to take it. Celeste seemed to prefer being invited near it, then staying long enough to matter. That made her far more dangerous. Nia met Celeste properly at Ashbourne's holiday event. The party had been arranged with the kind of polished effort corporate firms mistake for warmth, tasteful lighting, elegant floral pieces, soft music, expensive glasses, and just enough seasonal charm to make ambition look human for an evening. Dorian moved through the room with practiced ease, greeting investors and senior staff, while Nia stayed near him long enough to be seen, then drifted where conversation required less performance. That was when Celeste approached. She wore deep green that night, understated but chosen with precision. Her posture was perfect. Her smile arrived on time. Everything about her suggested a woman who understood the value of first impressions and never left them to chance. "Mrs. Vale," she said, extending her hand, "I've heard so much about you." Nia took the hand and returned the smile. "I hope only the good parts." Celeste held her gaze for half a beat longer than necessary. Mostly. It was such a small word, gentle on the surface, easy to miss if you were less awake than Nia was, but Nia heard it clearly. Not as an insult anyone could point to. Celeste was too disciplined for that. It landed instead as a suggestion, as if she had already been allowed near enough to Dorian's daily life to form private opinions, as if she knew things a stranger should not know, and wanted Nia to feel that knowledge without ever speaking it directly. The conversation moved on. A few polite lines about the event, A brief remark about year-end pressure, a compliment about the firm's growth. To anyone standing nearby, the exchange would have looked harmless. Nia knew better. Disrespect often hides behind manners when the person delivering it understands social risk. Celeste had not crossed a line the room could see. She had simply touched it and stepped back, leaving the meaning for Nia alone. When Celeste moved away to answer some request from across the room, Nia watched her join Dorian's side with a familiarity that seemed too practiced for someone still new enough to be introduced as staff. That was the moment the warning in Nia sharpened, not because one word had wounded her, because one word had confirmed instinct. After that night, Dorian mentioned Celeste more often. At first, the comments came wrapped in practicality. Celeste had reorganized a difficult week. Celeste had caught a scheduling conflict before it embarrassed him. Celeste had prepared briefing notes in a way that saved him time. Celeste understood how fast things moved now. Celeste stayed ahead of details better than most people on staff. Nia listened, without reacting too quickly. Competence deserves recognition. She knew that. She had built enough with Dorian to understand the value of people who reduce chaos instead of adding to it. But praise has layers, and Nia had spent years learning how to hear what lived under a person's wording. Dorian's language was beginning to shift. He did not only describe Celeste as helpful, he described her as calming, reliable, easy to work with, able to anticipate what he needed without long explanation. Once, after a particularly exhausting week, he loosened his tie in the kitchen and said, "I don't know what I'd have done this quarter without her." He meant the office. Nia heard more than the office. Emotional dependence rarely introduces itself with obvious confession. It hides inside relief, inside repeated gratitude, inside the growing comfort of being understood first by the person who organizes your daily world. Nia recognized the pattern not because Dorian had admitted anything, but because his tone carried the kind of ease that should have belonged more fully at home. He spoke about Celeste as if she absorbed pressure he no longer knew how to bring back to his marriage. That unsettled Nia more than attraction would have. Attraction can be named, confronted, rejected. Dependence is harder. It grows in blind spots. It convinces a person that proximity is harmless because desire has not been spoken aloud. Yet closeness shapes loyalty long before people admit where the line is moving. Each time Dorian praised Celeste, Nia heard a little less of the man who once brought his unfinished thoughts home first, and each time she heard it, the same truth pressed harder against her. The issue was no longer whether Celeste was capable. The issue was how much of Dorian's daily emotional life had started leaning in her direction. Nia chose her moment carefully. It happened on a late evening when Dorian came home tired enough to be honest if he wanted to be, but not yet so tired that he could hide behind exhaustion. He stood in the kitchen with his sleeves rolled up, reading through messages while she poured tea into 2 cups. The house was quiet. No event, no audience, no excuse for misunderstanding. She placed 1 cup near him. "Can I ask you something without you getting defensive?" Dorian glanced up. "That depends on the question. It depends on the answer." That earned half a smile, but it disappeared quickly when he saw she was serious. Nia leaned against the counter. "Are you bringing to Celeste things you should still be bringing home?" He blinked once. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, calm and direct, "you talk about her like she carries more of your daily life than an executive secretary should." Dorian's expression shut down at once. "Nia, I'm asking plainly so you don't have to pretend not to understand me." He set the phone face down. "She works closely with me. That's all. That wasn't my question." His jaw tightened. "You're reading too much into normal work." "Am I?" Nia asked. "Or are you hiding inside professional language because it sounds cleaner than the truth?" He gave a short, disbelieving breath. "There is no truth here beyond the obvious. She is efficient. She makes my life easier at the office. That's her job." Nia held his eyes. "And what exactly have you stopped expecting your wife to make easier?" For a second, something real moved across his face. Not guilt, exactly. Not yet. More like discomfort at being seen too clearly. But instead of stepping toward honesty, he stepped away from it. "This is unfair," he said. "I'm not doing this." And that was answer enough. not because he confessed anything, because avoidance is often the clearest confession a proud person is willing to offer before the truth has no place left to hide. Yet even then, the marriage was not dead. That was part of what made the distance harder to bear. If everything between them had gone cold at once, Nia might have found the truth easier to name, but their life still held small moments that refused to let go of what they had been. Some nights, Dorian came to bed after midnight and slid in beside her with care, as if trying not to wake her. A few minutes later, half asleep, he would reach for her waist or find her hand beneath the blanket and hold it there without knowing he had done it. His body remembered what his habits often forgot. On those nights, Nia lay still and let herself feel the ache of being loved in fragments. Other evenings brought brief tenderness that almost felt like the old version of them. He would loosen at last after a hard day, sit beside her on the sofa, and rest his head back with his eyes closed while she spoke softly about nothing urgent. Once, during a storm, the lights flickered, and he laughed under his breath before saying, "Remember the old apartment? We would have lost power by now." She smiled, and for a moment they were younger again, closer, still standing at the beginning of things instead of trying to measure what had been lost. Now and then he kissed her shoulder in bed and whispered, "I know I've been difficult." She would answer, "Then come back to me." He never argued with that line. He also did not fully obey it. Morning kept returning him to the same speed, the same distance, the same polished version of himself the world rewarded too easily. Still, those smaller moments mattered because they proved something important to Nia. The problem was not that love had vanished. The problem was that love was no longer receiving enough attention to stay strong in the shape it needed. Damage and death are not the same thing. Their marriage was hurt, neglected, pulled thin by pressure, ego, and misplaced comfort. But somewhere inside it, warmth still lived. And that warmth kept Nia from leaving before she had absolute clarity about whether the man she married was gone, or only buried under everything success had taught him to value too quickly. By then, Nia could feel pressure gathering toward a moment she would not be able to manage in private. Nothing dramatic had happened yet. No confession, no visible scandal, no scene large enough to force truth into the open. But she had lived long enough and watched enough people to know when the emotional weather around a life had started turning. Dorian was growing too comfortable in admiration. Celeste was too settled near him. Boundaries were soft where they should have been clear. And beneath all of it, Nia's own patience was changing shape. It was becoming less forgiving. Ashbourne's upcoming celebration for the major deal added to the feeling. The event had already become a topic at home and at the office. Another rooftop evening full of investors, executives, photographs, and expensive politeness. Dorian spoke of it as if it were simply another important night. Nia heard something else in it: exposure. Rooms like that do not create truth, but they pressure hidden things by forcing people to perform too close to the edge. She began noticing details more sharply. How often Celeste stood within arm's reach during planning discussions. How naturally Dorian deferred to her timing in front of others. How staff had begun reading their rhythm as normal. How quickly private discomfort can turn into public humiliation. Once enough people decide a line is harmless because no one has formally objected to it. One evening, while dressing for a smaller dinner event, Nia caught her own reflection and held it for a moment longer than usual. She looked composed, elegant, calm, every inch the woman people assumed they understood. But inside, certainty was building. Something was coming, not because fate demanded it, because patterns left unresolved rarely stay private forever. They seek a stage. They wait for a careless word, a sharp glance, a challenge asked in the wrong room. And when they find it, everything hidden underneath begins showing itself faster than anyone planned. Nia felt that truth pressing near. The next public moment, whenever it came, would not be harmless. It would force something private into the light. And once that happened, there would be no putting it back where it had been. The rooftop looked built for triumph. Glass rails caught the city light. Servers moved through the crowd with silver trays balanced at shoulder height. Low music sat beneath the voices of investors, executives, and guests who had learned how to sound relaxed while measuring one another. Chicago stretched beyond the building in clean lines of white and gold. and Ashbourne Capital stood at the center of it all, glowing with the confidence of a firm that had just closed the kind of deal people talked about for months. Dorian belonged to the room. That was clear the moment Nia stepped out of the elevator. He stood near the bar, one hand around a crystal glass, the other slipping easily from handshake to handshake, as if power had become second nature in his body. People leaned toward him when he spoke. They laughed a beat too quickly at his remarks. A cluster of senior investors held close, waiting for his attention. He wore success, well, too well. Nia paused at the entrance, only long enough to take in the shape of the evening. She wore deep blue, elegant and restrained. The kind of dress that did not beg to be noticed yet always was. Her hair framed her face softly. No heavy jewelry, no spectacle. She did not need any of it. Presence had never been something she purchased. She carried it. Heads turned as she crossed the rooftop. Not because she demanded the room, because grace unsettles shallow spaces when it enters without trying. Dorian saw her. For one brief second, his expression changed. The practiced confidence loosened. Something older, warmer, more human rose into his face. The version of him she had once known before public life taught him to perform himself. Then Celeste stepped closer to him with a folder in hand and said something low near his shoulder. The warmth vanished. Nia felt the shift from across the room. That, more than the skyline or the praise circling him, told her everything she needed to know about the state of her marriage that night. Nia did not go to him at once. She moved through the event with the quiet control of a woman who understood rooms like this too well to waste emotion early. She greeted two board members near the terrace edge, exchanged measured conversation with one of Ashbourne's outside advisors, and accepted a glass she barely touched. Each smile she gave was real enough to pass, restrained enough to protect her, but under the surface, she watched. Celeste remained near Dorian with a comfort that had become too practiced to dismiss, not clinging, not careless, worse, natural. She anticipated when he needed a document before he asked, leaned in when speaking to him, confident that the distance would not be questioned, adjusted details around him with the ease of someone who had grown used to occupying the space nearest his attention. Nia saw Dorian allow it. That was the part that mattered, not the woman stepping too close. The husband who had stopped noticing when closeness became disrespect. The longer Nia stood inside that realization, the less interested she became in extending patience one evening further. Hope had carried her far enough. Tonight required clarity. She found him near the bar after the crowd shifted slightly toward the opposite side of the rooftop. The city wind moved lightly through the open space. Music pressed gently under the talk around them. Celeste stood only a few feet away, speaking with a guest but angled in Dorian's direction. "We need to talk," Nia said. Dorian glanced at her, then at the people nearby. "Now?" "Yes, now." His jaw tightened. "Can this wait?" "It has waited long enough." Something sharpened in her voice. Not loud, but impossible to mistake. Dorian felt it. So did the small circle around them, though no one turned openly. In rooms like this, people have a talent for pretending not to listen while hearing everything. Nia stepped closer. "You have let this company into places in our marriage where it does not belong." Dorian's expression changed. Nia continued, eyes steady on his, "And you have let certain people stand where they should never have been allowed to stand." Dorian's first instinct was not reflection. It was defense. Nia saw it the moment his shoulders stiffened, the moment his eyes flicked to the people nearby. Not because he feared hurting her more, but because he feared being challenged where others might notice. That was the tragedy of what he had become. Years earlier, he would have heard her first. Now his pride heard the room first. "Do not do this here," he said under his breath. Nia did not move. "Then stop giving me reasons to." Celeste had gone quiet, a few feet away. Her posture remained polished, but her attention had narrowed. Two men at the bar stopped speaking, without fully turning. A woman across the space lowered her glass slowly, eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. Social pressure thickened, not through noise, but through awareness. The rooftop could feel a fracture forming. Dorian's mouth hardened. "You are making a scene." "No," Nia said. "I'm asking for respect." That line should have broken something open in him. Instead, it cornered him. The man who once built his life through hunger and discipline now stood trapped by his own image. He had spent too long being admired by people who rarely corrected him, too long being treated as the center of every room, too long confusing authority with immunity, and when a man like that feels exposed, he sometimes reaches for the cruelest thing available, not because it is true, but because it restores the illusion of control. For 1 second, Dorian looked at Nia, with anger sharpened by embarrassment. Then he said it again. "My secretary is twice the woman you'll ever be." The words did not rise. They landed. A clean, brutal sentence, spoken with enough force to carry beyond the space between them. It sliced through the music, through the polished conversations, through the fragile dignity of the evening. The nearby silence came instantly this time. Not gradual. Immediate. Nia went still. Celeste's face changed before she could hide it. And Dorian, though pride kept him standing upright, had already crossed into a place from which love would not return untouched. If someone you loved spoke to you like that in front of a crowd, would you walk away in silence, or would you make sure they never forgot the price of that moment? Tell me in the comments. And if you love stories where pride destroys the very thing it should protect, subscribe now, because this night is far from over. The rooftop seemed to hold its breath. No one rushed in. No one laughed it off. No one pretended the insult had been smaller than it was. The sentence hung in the air with the weight of a public wound, and every person close enough to hear it understood that they were no longer standing inside a celebration. They were standing inside the collapse of something private. Nia did not blink for a second longer than necessary. Her face remained composed, but the control in it made the scene harder to watch, not easier. If she had shouted, some people might have escaped into judgment. If she had cried, some might have hidden inside pity. But dignity forces people to sit with what actually happened. Dorian held his glass too tightly. The muscle in his jaw shifted once. His breathing changed. Somewhere beneath the anger, he knew he had gone too far. He knew the room knew it too. Yet the same pride that pushed the words out now held his apology hostage. He stood there inside his own sentence, unable to retract it, without admitting weakness before witnesses he had spent years training to admire him. Celeste remained near enough to feel the damage, and far enough to avoid direct responsibility. She looked stricken, but Nia hardly spared her a full glance. This was no longer about the secretary. This was about the husband. The man who had once built a future with her. The man who had once placed his entire hope in her belief. The man who had now chosen, in public, to cut at the very person who had stood beside him before any of these people cared to know his name. When Nia finally spoke, her voice was soft. That made it worse. "Do you believe that?" The question crossed the small distance between them with almost unbearable precision. It gave Dorian one last opening, one last chance to separate anger from truth and step back from the edge before the damage settled fully into shape. The crowd might have forgiven a harsh moment if he had corrected it fast enough. Nia might not have forgiven him quickly, but the line between cruelty and regret would at least have been clear. He said nothing. For one flicker of a second, something human moved across his face. Regret. Fear. Shame. Nia saw it, but he did not let it speak. His silence held where apology should have stood, and that silence told her more than any repeated insult ever could. It told her the sentence had not been a random slip. It told her some part of him had already been thinking in hierarchies, measuring women by usefulness, convenience, admiration, and ease. It told her he had allowed too much emotional decay to settle inside him without resistance. It told her the distance in their marriage had grown teeth. Nia lowered her glass to the bar beside her. Crystal touched stone with a small, clear sound that somehow carried through the stillness. She gave one controlled nod. Not agreement. Not surrender. Recognition. In that movement lived heartbreak, but also decision. Pain had stopped being confusing. The shape of it was clear now. She did not owe the rooftop a speech. She did not owe Dorian a dramatic collapse to prove his words had landed. He could see that they had, so could everyone else. Nia looked at him one last time, and what passed through her expression was not weakness. It was grief sharpened by knowledge. She was no longer asking who he had become. Tonight had answered that for her. The question now was what his answer would cost him. Nia turned and walked away. Her heels moved over the rooftop floor with measured grace, each step calm, even, controlled. She did not rush. She did not tremble. She did not look back. The crowd parted for her without being asked, instinctively making room for the kind of dignity most people only recognize after they have failed to protect it. No one stopped her. Some lowered their eyes. Others watched openly, caught between sympathy and discomfort. An older investor near the terrace glanced toward Dorian, then away again, as if even he understood there are some moments a decent witness should not stare at too long. Behind her, the rooftop began breathing again in fragments. A whisper near the bar, a quiet shift of feet, the low return of music that now sounded useless against what had just happened. But around Dorian, silence stayed heavier. He stood where she had left him, glass still in hand, shoulders rigid, staring at the space she no longer occupied. For the first time all evening, he looked less like the master of the room and more like a man abandoned by his own judgment. He took half a step forward, then stopped. Maybe he wanted to call her name. Maybe he wanted to explain. Maybe he had started hearing his own voice, the way everyone else had heard it. Whatever lived inside him in that moment came too late to save anything. Cruelty spoken once in public does not return obediently to silence. Celeste remained frozen a short distance away, stripped of all the smooth ease she had carried through the night. Her presence no longer looked elegant. It looked dangerous, not because she had spoken, because what had been allowed around her had now exposed something rotten in plain sight. Dorian watched Nia disappear toward the stairs, and the full emotional weight of the evening finally began pressing down. Not anger, not victory, only the cold aftermath of a sentence he could not take back, spoken to the one person who had once made his whole future possible. The house felt different after the rooftop, not louder, not colder in any obvious way, just changed, as if the insult had entered before Dorian did and taken a seat in every room. He came home that night long after Nia, expecting anger, maybe tears, maybe a confrontation sharp enough to let him defend himself. Instead, he found silence. Her side of the bed was occupied, the lamp was off, the air between them carried no invitation to speak. By morning, panic had begun working on him in small, ugly ways. He sent flowers first, white lilies, then roses, then a second arrangement when the first was turned away at the house by the staff, with a polite instruction from Nia that nothing should be brought inside for her. He called before lunch, no answer. He called after lunch, no answer. By evening, he was leaving messages that sounded less like authority and more like a man hearing his own helplessness for the first time in years. Nia, please call me back. I was angry. I know what I said. We need to talk. The messages kept coming. Some short, some too long. None of them carried the thing he most needed to say, with enough honesty to matter. He was still speaking from urgency, not understanding. The next day, he sent a text instead. I did not mean it. No reply. He sent another. I was angry and humiliated. That is not an excuse. Just talk to me. Still nothing. By the third day, Dorian had started checking his phone with the restless obsession of a man who had lost control of the one part of his life he assumed would wait. He read over old messages between them, as if tenderness from months earlier might help him reverse what had happened on that rooftop. It did not. He had built a company through pressure and persuasion. Neither skill was helping him now. Because Nia was not refusing noise with more noise. She was refusing him with absence. And absence, Dorian was beginning to learn, can terrify a person more than anger ever could when it comes from the one voice that used to know them best. Nia answered only once. The message came late in the afternoon of the third day, after a chain of texts from Dorian that had moved from apology to explanation to strained restraint. He had been sitting in his office, staring at his phone between meetings, when the screen lit up with her name. For a full second, relief hit him so hard he nearly stood. Then he opened the message. People reveal themselves fastest when they feel powerful. That was all. No greeting, no insult, no demand for space. No dramatic threat, just one sentence, clean and final in its own way, sitting on the screen with a calm that made his chest tighten. Dorian read it 3 times, The line did not shout. It did not accuse him in the language of rage, but its control made it worse. A furious message would have left him room to argue with emotion. This left him staring at judgment stripped of heat. Nia had taken what happened on the rooftop, reduced it to truth, and handed that truth back to him without decoration. He tried calling it once. No answer. He typed, deleted, typed again. That is not who I am. He stared at the words before sending them, then erased them. The sentence looked weak, even to him, because some part of him had already started understanding the point Nia was making. A person can speak kindly for years and still reveal something ugly in the moment pride feels safest. One sentence can expose what comfort has been protecting. He finally replied with, "Please let me explain." No answer. The silence after that text felt more complete than the silence before it. Nia had not given him hope. She had given him a mirror. And for the rest of the day, every meeting, every handshake, every polished conversation at Ashbourne felt slightly off in his own body. He kept hearing the line again. People reveal themselves fastest when they feel powerful. It unsettled him because it was not simply about the rooftop. It was about what kind of man he had become, while praise, influence, and unchecked ego settled around him. Nia had not merely rejected his apology. She had questioned his character. At Ashbourne, no one spoke openly at first. That was not how firms like theirs handled scandal when it touched the people at the top. They handled it through careful silence, lowered voices, altered eye contact, and the subtle social shift that tells you a story is moving through the building long before anyone confirms it aloud. By Monday morning, the rooftop incident had already begun traveling floor to floor, not as gossip dressed in excitement, but as something thinner, stranger, almost cautious. People had heard enough. An executive assistant on the events team mentioned the tension to a finance manager who had seen Nia leave early. A junior associate claimed he had only caught part of the exchange, but the part he caught was enough. Someone in investor relations had noticed Dorian looking unusually sharp with Celeste all evening and added that detail to the growing version passed quietly between offices. By noon, the story had become what workplace stories always become, a collection of facts, assumptions, and social instinct stitched together by people who think they are whispering privately while shaping public perception. Dorian felt it, not directly. No one challenged him. No one asked anything inappropriate. But the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations near him paused a fraction too fast. Two people speaking outside the conference room straightened when he approached. Celeste herself moved through the office with more restraint than usual, smooth as ever, but missing the easy confidence she had worn before the rooftop. Even she understood some line had become visible now. For Nia, the silence in the building would have been familiar, because silence often travels faster than speech in wealthy institutions. It protects the speaker while spreading the message just as effectively. The office still looked polished. Screens still glowed. Meetings still happened. Reports still moved from inbox to inbox. Yet, something had changed inside the culture. Dorian was no longer only the admired founder and public face of Ashbourne. He was also, now, the man people had begun privately measuring against the way he spoke to his wife when challenged. That kind of shift rarely stays contained. Once people sense weakness in someone who has long benefited from authority, they start noticing other things too. Spending habits, favored voices, careless approvals, the mood around the top floor. Respect does not always disappear loudly. Sometimes it thins by degrees. And somewhere in that thinning, the firm itself begins to breathe differently. Still, Dorian told himself he could manage this. He drew a line in his mind between what had happened at home and what mattered at Ashbourne. One was painful, yes, but personal. The other was structural, public, measurable, and still under his control. That separation comforted him because it preserved the last illusion he needed in order to keep moving with confidence. As long as his marriage crisis stayed private, his leadership image could remain intact, so he leaned into work. The upcoming board session gave him somewhere to direct his energy. Ashbourne was approaching a major expansion vote, one that would shape the firm's next phase and place his strategy firmly in front of the people whose approval mattered most. He prepared hard, which was what he had always done best when emotion threatened to interfere. Numbers steadied him. Forecasts obeyed logic. Presentations rewarded polish. In those spaces, he still knew how to win. He reviewed financial summaries with his team, refined talking points, tightened projections, rehearsed likely objections, and the answers he intended to give. The more he worked, the more he convinced himself that whatever damage the rooftop caused could be contained through strength, speed, and visible control. If he dominated the boardroom, the rest would settle. That belief kept him functional. It also kept him blind. Because what Dorian failed to understand was that leadership image does not live in a sealed room. Character follows a person into every space they enter, especially once people begin questioning it. If the company's culture had already grown too dependent on his charisma, then the fracture in his marriage was not entirely separate from the fracture in perception. It was part of the same story, power without correction. But Dorian was not ready to see that yet. He walked into the week, focused, sharp, and determined to restore order through performance. He told himself the board would see what it always saw: a capable executive, a successful expansion plan, a man in command of his firm and its future. His marriage, meanwhile, could be repaired later. At least, that was what he still believed. And belief, when it protects pride, has a way of surviving long after reality has already started preparing a harsher answer. The board session began with all the usual signs of high-level control. The conference room on Ashbourne's executive floor had been prepared before sunrise, water glasses aligned, screens tested, printed packets placed with mechanical precision at each leather chair. Beyond the glass, the city looked distant and cold, softened by height and money. Inside, the room carried the polished tension of a place where decisions do not shout, they land quietly and move millions. Dorian entered in a dark suit that restored some of the certainty he had been losing in private. He greeted the chairman, nodded to two board members joining in person, and exchanged measured remarks with the legal advisor near the presentation screen. Several investors would attend physically. Others were dialing in virtually. He had led meetings like this too many times to feel intimidated by the room itself. That steadied him. He took his seat and opened the packet with the composure of a man used to being the strongest presence at the table. His eyes moved over the agenda: financial summaries, expansion notes, risk review. One item mentioned confirmation of controlling commitments from key private stakeholders, but it did not catch his attention for long. Outside capital structures mattered, yes, though usually as background support to the larger strategy he intended to drive through the room. Nothing in the line gave him pause. Why would it? He knew who the visible investors were. He knew the board. He knew the flow of these sessions. And more than anything, he knew how to read rooms like this one when he needed to shape the outcome. Whatever uncertainty had followed him from home faded slightly as the meeting settled into familiar form. Business language restored part of his confidence. Numbers returned his footing. Process made him feel like himself again. By the time the chairman called the room to order, Dorian had rebuilt enough of his composure to believe the day would proceed as expected. There was no fear in him, no real reason for it, not yet. Because, at that moment, he still saw the boardroom as a place where control belonged to the prepared. He had no idea the most important person in the room had not arrived yet. The first part of the session moved exactly the way Dorian expected. Opening remarks, quarter performance, growth indicators, expansion timing. Questions came, but none severe enough to shake his footing. He answered with practiced authority, guiding the room through projections and strategy, with the calm rhythm that had made him successful in the first place. A few members nodded along. One investor asked about exposure risk in the new market. Dorian answered cleanly. The chairman made notes. The room stayed orderly. Then the agenda shifted. The chairman adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the packet before speaking. Before we move to the final vote, we need to confirm controlling commitments from key outside stakeholders. Dorian sat back, only mildly interested. This was routine enough. Useful, but rarely dramatic. The chairman continued. Our lead outside investor has requested to address the board directly before we proceed. That caught Dorian's attention just enough to make him look up. Across the table, One of the older board members exchanged a quick glance with legal counsel, but nothing in the moment appeared alarming. If anything, Dorian assumed the investor wanted reassurance, perhaps a few direct comments on governance or long-term structure before releasing final support. It happened. The larger the stake, the more likely someone wanted visibility into leadership and direction. Fine. Dorian could handle that. He folded his hands loosely on the table and waited. The room turned almost subtly toward the doors. Chairs settled. Papers stopped moving. Even the faint hum from the screen seemed to retreat behind the pause. It was not silence born of fear, just expectation, the ordinary kind that comes before an unknown participant enters a high-stakes room. Then the doors opened. Nia walked in. She wore soft gray, tailored perfectly, calm on her face, two legal advisors following a step behind her. No hesitation, no rush, no trace of the woman Dorian had left wounded days earlier on a rooftop. What entered instead was authority, measured and complete. Dorian's body went still before his mind caught up. Every eye in the room shifted toward her. And in that instant, before a single explanation had been offered, the balance of power changed. Nia did not hurry. She entered the boardroom with the kind of calm that changes a space before anyone understands why. Soft gray framed her cleanly, tailored with the same precision she brought to every serious decision. Her expression gave nothing away. No visible anger, no wounded pride, no sign of the woman Dorian had insulted on the rooftop. What stepped through those doors was something far more dangerous: control without noise. Two legal advisors followed a pace behind her, both carrying slim folders, both moving with the quiet confidence of people who already knew the ground beneath their feet was solid. Their presence did more than add formality. It altered the emotional temperature of the room. Board members straightened, without thinking. One investor lowered his pen. Another looked from Nia to the chairman, then back to Nia again, searching for context in a moment that offered none yet. Dorian felt the shock first in his body. His spine locked. His hand, resting near the packet in front of him, went still. For a second, his mind refused to arrange what his eyes were seeing into anything that made sense. Nia did not belong here like this. Not in this role. Not with counsel behind her, and the room reacting, as if her entrance had already been sanctioned at the highest level. She moved to the far end of the table, neither apologetic nor dramatic, and took her place with measured ease. No one asked whether she should be there. That, more than anything, unsettled Dorian. Permission had already been granted before the moment began. The chairman rose slightly from his seat in acknowledgement. Around the room, confusion deepened into attention. Some knew her only as Dorian's wife. Some recognized her from formal events. A few had likely underestimated her for years, without ever needing to say so aloud. But, whatever version of Nia they thought they knew was already collapsing under the weight of her presence. She had not spoken yet. She did not need to. Authority had entered ahead of explanation, and every person at that table could feel it. The chairman adjusted his glasses, glanced once at the legal documents before him, and spoke with formal care. For the sake of clarity in the minutes, he said, let the record reflect that Mrs. Nia Calloway Vale is the beneficial principal behind Marlowe Strategic Holdings and its affiliated positions. The words landed in stages. A board member near the center frowned and looked down at his packet. One of the outside investors blinked once, then sat back slowly, as if distance might help the sentence make more sense. The general counsel folded his hands and said nothing, which told Dorian this had been confirmed long before he walked into the room. The chairman continued, her structures represent the largest outside capital position currently supporting Ashbourne Capital. This time the silence came complete. No one shifted papers. No one cleared a throat. Even the people joining virtually seemed to disappear into the weight of the statement. Marlowe Strategic Holdings had been treated for years as a serious but discreet stakeholder. Stable, patient, private, the kind of investor position people respected without fully understanding, because the structure was clean and the money was real. Dorian knew the name. He had seen it on reports, in board materials, in commitment summaries reviewed too quickly because it sat outside the daily center of his ego. He had never traced it back to Nia. The truth cracked open something larger than surprise. It shattered assumption. Across the table, One of the senior directors looked at Nenie with entirely new attention, no longer as a spouse attached to the firm's public face, but as a principal force inside its financial spine. Another quietly straightened the notes in front of him, the small reflex of a person realizing the hierarchy in his mind had just been rearranged. Dorian could not speak, not because he lacked words, because too many old details were now rushing toward each other at once, trying to become a picture he should have understood years earlier. Nia remained still. No triumph showed on her face. That, too, struck the room. She did not look like someone enjoying revenge. She looked like someone who had arrived for business. And that difference made the revelation hit even harder. Once the chairman finished, Dorian stopped hearing the room in a normal way. The boardroom was still there. The table, the packets, the skyline beyond the glass. Yet his mind had already turned inward, racing across years of moments he had filed away without understanding. Nia, asking unusually sharp questions during expansion talks. Nia, pushing back on risk disguised as momentum. Nia, noticing weakness in staffing choices before anyone else named them. Nia reviewing details he had assumed she cared about only because she was thoughtful, only because she had always been perceptive, only because she was his wife. No, that was not all it had been. She had been looking at Ashbourne from a position of responsibility far larger than he had imagined. His breathing shifted. He remembered old nights in the study when she challenged a proposal, and he adjusted it. Early phases of funding when support had appeared in ways he never fully tracked because success began rewarding him before humility required full accounting. Questions she asked in recent years about spending, governance, approval lines, and culture drift. Questions he had started waving away as concern shaped too much by emotion. But those questions had not come only from a wife feeling distance. They had come from a woman with skin in the firm, at a level no one in the room could now ignore. The humiliation of the rooftop came rushing back with brutal force. "My secretary is twice the woman you'll ever be." He had said that to her. To the woman who had seen his value when banks laughed. To the woman who had risked money on him before proof existed. To the woman who, without public title or applause, had grown into the largest outside power, holding the firm steady. Memory turned against him. Even her silences looked different now. The times she stopped arguing and watched him instead. The measured way she had asked whether he still valued her without performance, though he had not recognized the question in full until this moment. Every warning she gave him now returned, sharpened by the fact that she had never been guessing from the sidelines. She had known. She had studied the firm more carefully than half the people at this table. And he, in all his public confidence, had been arrogant enough to mistake her calm for dependence and her restraint for lesser power. When Nia finally spoke, her voice carried cleanly across the room. "I invested in Ashbourne because I believed in what it was meant to be." No one interrupted. "I continued investing because I believed it could still be protected from becoming the kind of firm success often creates, polished on the outside but weakened at the center." She did not look at Dorian first. She addressed the board as a whole, which only deepened the seriousness of what followed. Her words were measured, never rushed, and built with the discipline of someone who had spent a long time thinking before choosing to speak in a room like this. She outlined the issues plainly, spending tied too heavily to image rather than operational strength, approval paths that had become too dependent on personal trust, leadership habits that rewarded proximity over challenge, a culture where correction had grown less welcome as admiration increased. She spoke of drift, not collapse, of warning signs, not theatrics. That made every point harder to dismiss. One board member asked for clarification on oversight weakness. Nia gave specifics. Another asked whether she believed the expansion itself was unsound. She answered that growth was still possible, but only if the firm stopped confusing momentum with discipline. Every response exposed the same reality. She knew the internal patterns, the margins, the risks, and the human failures inside the structure more intimately than many of the people formally charged with guarding them. Only after the room had fully absorbed that did her gaze shift to Dorian. "For the record," she said, "my presence here is not personal revenge, it is governance." That line changed everything. Several board members who had spent months nodding through presentations suddenly looked far more alert. One investor turned a page and began writing rapidly. The chairman did not speak, but even his posture shifted into sharper seriousness. Nia had done something difficult and devastating in a single sentence. She had stripped the moment of gossip and forced it into principle. This was no longer a private marital fracture leaking into business. This was a leadership issue, a culture issue, a control issue, and Dorian, sitting in the center of his own carefully built authority, could feel the room beginning to move away from him in real time. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the quiet person in the room, you know why this moment matters. Tell me in the comments, did Dorian deserve this reckoning, or did he ruin himself long before Nia walked through those doors? And if you want stories where pride gets answered by truth, subscribe now, because the fall is not over yet. The boardroom no longer belonged to Dorian. That realization moved across the table with almost physical force. Questions sharpened, assumptions dissolved. People who had once accepted his framing of Ashbourne's growth now began examining the firm through the lens Nia had just imposed: governance, discipline, and leadership character. The difference was immediate. It was also brutal. A senior director, who had rarely challenged Dorian's expansion language, asked for a more detailed breakdown of discretionary executive spending over the last 4 quarters. Another requested a review of approval structures tied to travel, representation, and image-related costs. Legal counsel asked that the culture and reporting concerns raised by NIA be entered formally into the record for committee follow-up. Dorian tried to respond. He still had his facts, still had his command of numbers, still had the instincts that had carried him through harder business fights than this. But instinct works poorly. When the center of the room is shifted and everyone knows it, each answer he gave now sounded incomplete, because Nia had already named the deeper problem. Not a lack of performance, but a growing failure of discipline at the top. His old strengths were turning against him. Confidence now looked like avoidance. Smooth language looked like cover. Even his composure, once admired, began to resemble the polish of a man too insulated by praise to understand how exposed he had become. Nia had not shouted. She had not humiliated him in the cheap way. She had done something worse. She had told the truth in a room built to respect structure. And structure was now taking her side. What Dorian felt at that table was not only shock, it was displacement. For the first time in years, he was no longer the clearest authority in the room, and every second that passed made that harder to recover. By the time the board moved toward revised controls and delayed approval on the expansion structure, Dorian understood something he had spent years avoiding. He had not merely lost a moment. He had lost command. The shift was total, though no one announced it in those words. It showed in what the chairman prioritized, in the new caution behind each question, in the willingness of people around the table to challenge items they once let pass under the force of Dorian's confidence. Ashbourne was still his firm in public image, still tied to his name in the press and in the market, but inside the room where power became real, the foundation beneath that image had cracked. And the crack had a face. Nia sat at the far end of the table with the same calm she wore when she entered, papers in order, posture composed, never overreaching, never performing triumph. She did not need to. Her authority had already proven itself through fact, restraint, and timing. The contrast between them felt unbearable to Dorian. He had entered the meeting, expecting to guide the room. She had entered, expecting to correct it. She had succeeded. He looked at her once more and saw, with a clarity that came too late to save his pride, how false his private story of their marriage had become. He had reduced her in his mind without ever saying so fully aloud, reduced her to someone who would remain beside him no matter how little he listened, reduced her to a wife who felt deeply, supported quietly, and endured what success demanded, reduced her, most unforgivably, to someone whose value he thought he already understood. He had been living inside a lie built from ego, the lie that visible power is greater than silent power, the lie that attention equals substance, the lie that the woman he had humiliated on a rooftop was standing behind him rather than holding up part of the world he was using to feel important. Now the room saw what he had failed to see, and because they saw it, he had no shelter left. He sat there with his notes, his polished suit, his prepared arguments, and the ruins of his own assumption all around him. The board no longer looked to him first. The future of the firm no longer felt secured by his voice alone. Even the version of reality he had been carrying, husband as center, wife as shadow, collapsed beyond repair. Nia had not changed in that room. The truth had, and Dorian was the last person to recognize it. The board did not leave the meeting unchanged. By the time final remarks were made, the expansion plan Dorian had expected to push through on the strength of momentum no longer stood in its original form. The board approved a revised structure instead, one shaped by caution, oversight, and the authority Nia had brought into the room without raising her voice once. New controls would govern discretionary spending, reporting lines would be reviewed, an oversight committee would be formed with greater independence than Dorian had grown used to. Future approvals tied to expansion would require tighter review, clearer accountability, and less reliance on executive comfort. No one called it a defeat out loud. People in rooms like this rarely use plain words when power has just shifted. They prefer cleaner language, revised framework, governance, enhancement, structural refinement. But beneath every polished phrase sat the same truth. Dorian had walked in expecting endorsement. He was leaving with limits. Nia had not demanded punishment. She had demanded standards. That made the outcome harder for anyone to resist. The chairman closed the session with formal restraint, thanking stakeholders for their candor and reaffirming the board's duty to protect the long-term health of the firm. His tone remained even, but his gaze lingered on Nia with a seriousness it had never publicly carried before. Around the table, documents were gathered with slower hands. Pens clicked shut. Chairs moved back in measured silence. Every motion in the room carried the weight of people trying to return to normal procedure after witnessing something far more personal and far more revealing than ordinary corporate correction. Dorian sat still through all of it. His notes remained open in front of him, though he had stopped seeing the words. Numbers that looked solid hours earlier now seemed strangely flimsy against what had happened. He understood the policy changes. He understood the governance shift. What he could not yet fully hold was the deeper wound beneath it, that the strongest corrective force in the room had come not from an opposing firm, not from a hostile investor, not from a rival at all, but from the woman he had chosen to belittle in public. When the meeting ended, people stood carefully, as if sudden movement would cheapen what had just taken place. Some approached Nia first, not with warmth exactly, but with respect newly sharpened by knowledge. A board member who had spent years greeting her with the polite distance reserved for spouses now thanked her for her clarity in the formal tone one uses with real influence. Another investor paused long enough to tell her her perspective had been valuable to the firm's future. Legal counsel nodded to her with the ease of someone already adjusting to a hierarchy that had become visible only today. They were not responding to drama. They were responding to truth. And that, Dorian realized, was the part no one in the room would forget. Not the shock of her identity as the lead outside investor, though that alone was enough to alter years of assumption. Not even the governance changes now attached to her presence. What they would remember was how calmly image had been stripped away, how quickly performance had weakened once tested against substance, how the woman many of them had treated as an elegant extension of Dorian's life had revealed herself to be one of the central forces holding Ashbourne steady. Everyone leaving the boardroom knew they had witnessed more than a business adjustment. They had watched illusion fail. The firm's public story had long placed Dorian at the center, builder, strategist, public face, voice of growth. That story was not fully false, but it had been incomplete in a way that now felt almost embarrassing. Nia's authority did not erase what Dorian had accomplished. It exposed what his version of events had left out. It exposed the hidden architecture beneath the visible tower. Across the room, Dorian remained near his chair, while others filtered out in slow, thoughtful lines. A few people glanced at him before leaving, not with open judgment, but with the altered regard reserved for someone whose command has been broken in public. Respect had not disappeared entirely, but it had changed. It now carried caution, and caution, in a room that once leaned toward him so easily, felt almost like exile. By the time the last of the outside participants stepped into the hall, the boardroom had become quieter, larger, and far less forgiving than when the meeting began. At last, the room emptied enough to leave only the essentials. The chairman exited with counsel, after a brief word to one of the advisors. A final assistant slipped out carrying unused water glasses and a stack of marked packets. The door clicked shut behind them, and for the first time since Nia entered, silence settled fully over the boardroom. Dorian stayed where he was. Nia gathered her papers with the same unhurried care she had shown all day. Each sheet aligned neatly, each folder returned to order. She gave no sign that the room's emotional aftermath mattered more to her than finishing what she came to do. That composure forced Dorian to stand inside his own disarray without help. He finally spoke. "You were the investor." The words sounded weak, even to him, too obvious, too late. But they were all he had at first. Nia looked up. Yes. For how long? Her gaze held his without softness, though it was not cruel. Long enough. That answer struck him harder than a detailed timeline would have. It implied years. Years of his not knowing, years of her seeing more than he understood. Years of conversations he had entered with misplaced confidence, because he assumed he knew the shape of power around him. Dorian swallowed. Why didn't you tell me? It was the question beneath all the others. Why had she remained quiet while the firm grew, while the board treated her one way, while he moved through the world thinking he understood exactly who was standing beside him? Nia set the final folder down. Her voice, when it came, was steady. Because I needed to know something first. Dorian waited. The city beyond the glass looked far away now, as if even the skyline had withdrawn to let the truth between them finish speaking. He took a slow breath. Know what? For the first time since the meeting began, something close to pain moved openly through his face. Not the pain of embarrassment alone, the pain of a man beginning to suspect that the answer to his question will tell him far more about himself than about the woman standing across from him. And Nia, seeing that, did not rescue him from it. I needed to know whether you valued me, Nia said, without the power to impress you. The sentence entered the room softly and changed everything again. Dorian stared at her, and for a moment the boardroom, the meeting, the legal documents, all of it receded behind the weight of that one truth. She had not hidden herself to play a game. She had not stayed quiet because she lacked confidence. She had waited because she needed an answer only time could reveal. She needed to know whether the man who loved her saw her worth without needing titles, visible authority, or the kind of influence that men like him are trained to respect on sight. Nia continued before he could speak. In the early years, I believed you did. You listened to me because you trusted my mind, not because you knew how much money I had, or what I could move, or what position I might hold inside the firm. That mattered to me. Her eyes never left his. But success changes people. Sometimes slowly, sometimes so quietly they do not notice it until it has already changed what they honor in others. I needed to know whether your respect for me could survive a world where applause came easier than honesty. Dorian lowered his eyes for a second, then lifted them again, as if shame itself had weight. And? He asked, though the answer was already standing between them. Nia's expression did not harden. It did not need to. You gave me that answer on the rooftop. He felt the words like a blow. Not because they were loud, because they were clean. That was always her way when she chose truth, fully, no clutter, no wasted language. She left him nowhere to hide inside confusion. The insult he had thrown in anger had become evidence in a test he never knew he was taking. And he had failed it in the worst possible way. Not privately, not under pressure no one could see, but in front of a crowd, with pride feeding the cruelty and silence confirming it. For the first time, Dorian understood how complete the loss had been. He had not only humiliated his wife, he had exposed the measure of his own shallowness at the exact moment he believed himself most powerful. Dorian sank slowly into the chair behind him, though he had no memory of deciding to sit. The posture that had carried him through years of meetings, negotiations, interviews, and rooms full of eager approval was gone now. He no longer looked like the man who knew how to dominate a table with calm confidence. He looked like a man forced, at last, to stand in front of the full record of what he had ignored. His wife's intelligence, her restraint, her private success, her warnings, her value, all the things he had once relied on and later began treating as background certainty, steady enough to remain, familiar enough to underappreciate, close enough to wound without imagining real consequence. He put a hand over his mouth and breathed through it once. Hard. "I thought I knew you," he said. Nia answered without hesitation. "You knew enough. You stopped honoring what you knew." That truth cut deeper than accusation could have, because it meant the issue was not ignorance alone, it was neglect. He had not failed to recognize her from lack of evidence. He had failed because ease, status, and ego had slowly taught him to value what the world praised more loudly than what had been beside him from the start. The boardroom reveal had not created her importance. It had only removed the disguise around it. Dorian looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I ignored things I should have seen. Yes. I dismissed things I should have listened to. Yes." The simplicity of her answers stripped him further. No argument, no performance, just confirmation. He had spent so long becoming a public success that he had let part of his private character go underfed, and now the cost stood in front of him. Not abstract, not symbolic, but personal. A woman he loved, a firm he built, a version of himself he once respected, all put under harsh light at once. He could not outtalk this moment. Could not charm it, manage it, or smooth it over with polished regret. This required something he had not practiced enough lately: humility without defense. For the first time in years, Dorian Vale had nothing impressive left to stand behind. Only the truth, and the truth was not flattering. Nia picked up the last folder and held it lightly against her side. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them had changed again. It was no longer the charged silence of a public rupture or the stunned pause of a boardroom revelation. It was the quieter silence that comes after truth has done its work and left two people standing in what remains. Dorian looked at her as if he were searching for some familiar version of her he could return to, the wife from the early years, the woman at the diner, the partner who sharpened his plans and steadied his storms. But she had not disappeared. That was the point. She had been here the entire time. He was the one who had let image blur his vision. His voice came lower now. "I don't know how I missed this." Nia's face softened, but only slightly, in the way a person's expression softens when mercy and disappointment exist together. "You didn't miss it," she said. "You stopped looking." The words settled between them with final force. Dorian closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the room felt stripped of every false comfort he had brought into it. He saw no stage left for pride, no angle from which to protect himself without sounding smaller than he already felt. The woman before him no longer fit the reduced shape he had placed her in. She never had. The difference now was that the truth had been made undeniable, not only to him, but to the firm, the board, and the world he had spent years teaching to admire him. Nia moved toward the door. He stood, instinct pushing him to stop her, but he did not reach out. Something in him finally understood that interruption would be another kind of disrespect. So he remained where he was and watched her, his face carrying the raw stillness of a man who has been forced to recognize the full cost of his blindness. At the doorway, she turned just enough for her voice to reach him clearly. "Now you know exactly who I have always been." Then she left, and Dorian remained alone in the boardroom, surrounded by papers, glass, city light, and the shattered remains of a story he could no longer tell himself about power, love, or the woman he had spent too long failing to see. That night, the house felt quieter than usual, as if even the walls understood that something had broken too deeply for noise to cover it. Nia sat in the library beneath a warm lamp, a book open in her lap, though she had not turned a page in several minutes. When Dorian appeared at the doorway, he looked different. No sharpened confidence, no polished control, no defensive charm waiting to soften the room. He stood there, with empty hands, and a face stripped of every habit success had taught him to wear. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I do not deserve another chance tonight." He stepped farther into the room, slowly, like a man who understood that speed would only cheapen what he had come to say. Nia closed her book and placed it beside her, giving him her attention without giving him comfort. Dorian swallowed once before speaking again. I said something cruel to the most valuable person in my life. I spoke to you like you were easy to replace. The words seemed to cost him. You were never easy to replace. You were never second to anyone. He lowered his eyes for a moment. I made you sound small when half of what I built stands on what you gave me. Nia let the silence sit between them before answering. She did not rush to rescue him from the weight of his own confession. She had done too much of that already in smaller ways over the years. When she finally spoke, her tone stayed calm, but the question landed with sharp precision. Do you miss me? She asked, or do you miss being wrong? Dorian looked up at once, and something in his face shifted under the force of it. She held his gaze, and did not soften the moment, because those are not the same thing. And I will not confuse your wounded pride for love. For a moment, Dorian seemed unable to move past the truth of her question. Then he answered in a way he had not answered her in a long time, without polish, without strategy, without trying to sound better than he was. I miss my wife, he said. I miss the woman who made hard seasons feel worth surviving. I miss the way you knew me before money made me louder. I miss being seen by someone who understood me and stayed. I miss our life before I started giving strangers the best of me and bringing you what was left. His voice lowered. I miss us. Nia rose from her chair, but only enough to stand before him, not enough to close the distance he had created over time. Love does not survive where respect is starving, she said quietly. You cannot humiliate someone, ignore their warnings, and then expect old feelings to carry everything back into place. Dorian nodded, his expression tight with shame. He did not argue. He did not ask for instant forgiveness. That mattered. Nia touched the front of his shirt with light fingers. More memory than surrender. Wanting me back is not enough. He answered at once. I know. I will have to become different, not only sound different. Dorian lifted a hand slowly and brushed one loose strand of hair away from her face, then stopped there, leaving the final choice with her. That restraint moved through Nia more deeply than any speech could have. After a brief pause, she stepped closer. Their kiss was soft and familiar, but heavy with everything still unresolved. It carried regret, love, grief, and a fragile hope neither of them trusted yet. When they parted, he rested his forehead lightly against hers and closed his eyes. Neither called it healing. Neither pretended the wound had vanished. But for the first time in a long while, the future no longer felt completely closed. What came next was not magic. It was work. No grand promise repaired what pride had damaged. No single apology erased public disrespect. Rebuilding asked for slower things: patience, restraint, consistency, and the courage to live differently after speaking badly. Nia did not become soft because Dorian had finally understood her value. Dorian did not expect one honest night to restore years of neglect. They moved carefully, like two people crossing fragile ground with full awareness of what could break beneath them. The love between them had not vanished, but love alone was no longer enough. Now proof had to stand where promises once stood. Dorian began where he should have begun long ago, with boundaries. He changed access around his office, shifted reporting structures, and made sure professional closeness stayed professional. He stopped rewarding comfort over discipline. He came home earlier, not once for display, but repeatedly, until routine changed shape. He listened without reaching for defense. When Nia spoke, he let her finish. At work, he accepted challenge with less ego and more thought. At home, he relearned the difference between being admired and being worthy. Humility did not come easily to him, but he finally understood that strength without humility had nearly cost him everything important. Nia did not measure change by speeches. She measured it by pattern. Did he return when he said he would? Did he listen when correction came? Did he protect the line he once ignored? These were the questions that mattered now. She watched him with steadiness, not suspicion alone, but not innocence either. Trust, once strained, does not return because a person wants it back. It returns when action becomes boring in its consistency. Over time, Dorian's efforts stopped looking like guilt management and started looking like character. Nia allowed that to matter. Not quickly, not blindly, only at the pace truth could support. Their marriage did not heal through speeches. It began breathing again, through smaller things. Tea on the terrace after long days. Shared silence that no longer felt heavy. Honest talks where neither rushed to win. Some nights, Dorian cooked badly and laughed when Nia corrected him. Some mornings he reached for her hand across the kitchen counter without thinking, and this time the gesture felt present, not automatic. Warmth returned in fragments, but the fragments held. A shoulder touched while passing, a longer glance, a softer goodnight. Nothing dramatic, which made it real. They were not returning to who they had been. They were building something wiser together. Months later, at a private founders event, a young entrepreneur asked Nia what success costs when people are not careful. She answered without rushing, and the room quieted to hear her. Success means little if it costs kindness, tenderness, and respect, she said. Many people build wealth and lose their ability to love well. They gain influence and forget how to stay gentle. They start by wanting freedom and end up creating lonely lives. So choose carefully what success is allowed to take from you. Across the room, Dorian heard every word. This time, he did not need public shame to recognize the most valuable truth in sight. That was the lesson beneath everything. Respect matters more than image. Quiet support often carries the greatest weight. Love can survive injury, but only when truth is faced and change is lived. Dorian finally learned that the woman beside him had never been ordinary, only underestimated. Nia learned that second chances should never be handed over cheaply. Together, they proved that healing is possible, though never automatic. So tell me, what do you think mattered most in this story? Love, respect, patience, or accountability? Share your answer in the comments. And if you want more stories with deep lessons and strong emotion, like, share, and subscribe.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for choosing stories that ask more of you. The next story will be waiting.